Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to this week's episode of the Next Pivot Point podcast. As always, I am joined by a wonderful guest, Tamara Thorpe. She is CEO of Real Global, helping her clients discover how wonderful intercultural and multi-generational differences are and how they can use those differences to enrich their organizations. She has more than 20 years of experience in international education and training, designing and facilitating intercultural and leadership programs to help organizations better navigate the complexities of a global economy. She's also a skilled organizational development practitioner who has helped inspiring nonprofit organizations, renowned university, and complex government organizations delivering essential learning interventions and change management projects to build healthy organizations that challenge the status quo and make a difference. Clients include the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center, the YWCA of New Mexico, United Way, George Washington University, University of Victoria, and British Columbia. Tamara is also a speaker and activist who's advocated for racial justice and gender equality to create thriving communities and a fair and just be society. She shares her story of her biracial identity and development through a collaborative performance piece, Who Am I?, that she has performed in both the US and Canada. She's recognized as a thought leader in leadership and understanding differences and has been a guest expert on the top podcasts, blogs, and radio shows for the next generation of leaders. She holds a BA in linguistics from the University of California, San Diego, and a master's in arts and leadership and training from Royal Roads University in Victoria. She's been a member of the Society of Intercultural Education, Training, and Research since 2006 and currently serves on the board for both CTAR Ireland and CTAR Europa. Tamara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow. Well, I'm excited to dig in on generational differences. And as you know, we have so many different generations in the workforce today and all the intercultural pieces too that I know are near and dear to your heart. But before we do that, Tamara, tell us, how did you get into this work? How did you find your way into the D&I space?
It's been an interesting journey. I think part of it is deeply rooted in my own identity journey and growing up feeling different and experiencing what it was like to not be like the dominant or majority culture, and having lots of questions around my own experience and how I defined myself and the pressure that I had most of my life with people wanting me to define my racial and cultural identity. So I think that sparked a curiosity in me. And then, when I was 16, I had my first opportunity to travel abroad. And sometimes I feel redundant because I share the story so much, but it is one of those really life-changing moments. Not only was it an incredible summer abroad that probably most 16-year-olds would enjoy, but it really ignited this passion for me in exploring culture and differences, and how we as humans, as friends, as family members, navigate and understand difference as we build relationships, work and travel and engage with people who have different backgrounds. And so I have, really used that experience to guide and direct the work that I have done, early in my career as an international English language teacher, to moving into coordinating international programs for universities, nonprofit organizations, and then eventually becoming a leadership consultant and trainer, and really recognizing and exploring what a crucial skill it is for leaders to have that kind of intercultural competence and cultural competence and ability to understand and navigate difference in really complex ways that sometimes gets taken for granted.
Yeah, we do take for granted our own lived experiences, or sometimes thinking, oh, well, everyone has to understand this, and maybe not. But based on your own experiences growing up, I love that piece of, belonging to different cultures and not seeing yourself reflected in the majority group. That's all too often common for folks that, are of a different culture than the majority group, are of a different gender identity or sexual orientation. There's so many different dimensions to diversity. But I know what you're really, the work that you love to do, Tamara, is around this next generation of leaders and thinking about the multi-generational lens of the workplace today. Now more than ever, we have so many different generations coexisting and leading together. Tell us, why is it important to engage this next generation of leaders?
It's an interesting and relatively new dilemma, like you said. I remember when I entered the workforce, the majority of folks in the workforce were baby boomers. There might have been one or two people from, the traditionalist or silent generation, as they're often known. But we really had two generational cohorts in the workplace. And so in terms of generational differences, there was sort of not, it really didn't have a significant impact. There were kind of new folks and, more seasoned folks and folks who've been around. And I think that's the way it had been for a really long time. And, one of the things that happened at the turn of the century, which we've all lived through, is we saw that there was a huge shift in demographics in the workplace as traditionalists and boomers remained in the workforce. And so today, one of the key differences that we see is not that millennials are so much more unique and or have such unique challenges or characteristics that they bring to the workplace, but that for the first time we have 4 and in some cases 5 generations in the workplace, and in many cases in positions where they're you have younger folks leading, working with older folks, or working as their peers in management and leadership teams. And so this is a real dynamic shift in society and within organizations. And, for me, this work really stemmed out of having incredible mentors growing up and early in my career, and really wanting to sort of pay that forward. And so in my work, mentoring and coaching younger folks, I somehow managed to really hone that into a career space that really sort of helps bring and usher in the next generation into a leadership space. But I think it's important that organizations recognize that, this is new for everybody. And when we look at how we run in our organization and lead folks in it, understanding those differences, it's really important.
It is. It's so important. And I think one that, like, sometimes in the diversity work, I don't know about you, but the generational piece, it'll come up, it'll surface. It just surfaced in a workshop I was doing this morning. An older white gentleman was sharing, well, of course I have privilege. Like, that's the world I grew up in. And he admitted, age was a part of that. And then the younger generations, I think we all look to them to, like, solve the diversity problem. Like, they get it. They're going to be the ones to save us from ourselves.
Yeah.
And then you had this, like, middle group, like the Gen Xers, like myself, that's kind of like the sandwich generation of, like, well, what the heck? Like, where do we fit into all of this? And it's just so fascinating. I'm curious, with multiple generations in the workforce, maybe help our listeners explain how do you look at the different, what are the different generations that are all in the workforce today? And like, how are they different? And also like, what do they have like the same? I think sometimes we look at things as like, we're all completely different, but maybe there's things that we have more in common as well across generations.
Absolutely. I think one of the things when we first experience difference is we really focus on those differences, and sometimes in a hyper way, or we completely ignore them and mask them, right? And what is in between is understanding the differences, looking at where they can be bridged, and bridging those differences with, where we have some common ground. So in the 5 generations that we have today that generational researchers really focus on is the silent generation, which is also known as the traditionalist generation, which in general is between 1928 and 1945. Different generational research, you'll see those years shift plus or minus 1 or 2 years. And those are folks that are sort of 75 and older, 74, 75 and older. And then the baby boomer generation, which is 1946 to 64. So that's our 55 and older. And like you, I'm a Gen Xer, and that's our sort of 1965 to 1980, which is, our 39 to 54 group. Which is the smallest generation in the workforce. Today, they're outnumbered by boomers and millennials being the largest cohort in the workplace. And they are folks who were born between 1981 and 1996. One of the things that people seem to forget is, millennials are, 23, 24 up to 38. So millennials are adults. They're not
I'm right at the cusp. I'm on the edge of
yes, you might be a zennial. There's a small cohort of people that don't feel quite like a millennial or quite like a Gen Xer and are refer to themselves often as zennials. And I think similar to almost any identity, a lot of folks don't connect with their generational cohort. And, you can identify, as a zennial or a Gen X or a millennial, it's your choice. Identity is yourself best. So I think everybody always has a choice in how they identify. And then, of course, Gen Xers or Gen Z is our 1997 to 2012. And then we have a new generation. We think of all the children that have been born this year and last year, and how that's going to shape that next incoming generation. So, in the workplace, though, we're really looking at, as I said, millennials are the largest cohort in the workplace with baby boomers. And I think what's interesting is, to your point, is millennials and baby boomers have more in common than they think that they do. So there certainly are things around how they were brought up that are extremely different, because the world in the 40s and 50s and 60s was certainly very different than the last 20, 30 years. But both generations are incredibly resilient generations who have grown up during a time of chaos, financial instability, and war. And so because of that, these are two cohorts that are able to function in high levels of uncertainty. And I think that is something that is worth recognizing between both of those cohorts. As a Gen Xer, I often say our generation is sort of a soft, spoiled group in the middle, where our generation really grew up during a really golden age of economic growth and stability, and where there was sort of some global peace. And when I was in college and in my early 20s, and I had friends that joined the military, they were joining the military to get their college paid for, and they'd go in for 2-3 years and come out and have their college paid for, and that was the extent of it. But when boomers and millennials joined the military, they went to war. And so there's something that really shapes and informs that generation. And I think something sometimes that gets lost when we're being critical of a specific generation. And I think then, some of the divides that we see certainly are some core value differences, as well as, uh, technological advancement, as well as trust. I think one of the biggest challenges to navigate in the workplace when it comes to generational differences is boomers have a lot more trust in organizations and institutions, and millennials have zero trust in organizations
So
and
true. Especially
institutions.
banks. I mean, look at what happened in 2008. They remember that.
They and I, it's such a interesting thing. Particularly banks is such a perfect example, and it comes up all the time. Is I do a lot of work in the tech space, and I know tech entrepreneurs. We say, well, how do we get older folks on our app, and how do we get them to do financial transactions on our app? And what's so fascinating, right, is boomers, who is the group that, generation that grew up ordering things on the phone, giving their credit card number to a stranger over the phone, right? Like I remember the days as a kid as, going into Sears Roebuck, and we'd go into the back section where they had the catalogs, and you'd pick up the phone and go through the catalog and order stuff. And that's how boomers grew up. And so they still trust that process of calling and giving their phone number or their credit card number to somebody over the phone, which we know is probably the least secure way to conduct a financial transaction in modern times. Whereas millennials are far more comfortable doing all their financial transactions from their phone, and in putting their money in any form of an institution that is not a bank. And so that's why, you see the growth of these new sort of virtual banks like Chime and, Revolut, and you see these different kind of tech companies doing really well because folks would rather have their money in their phone than in a bank, so to speak.
Right.
And then that translates into the workplace, when an organization says we're going to do this, change this, and hire this person, trust us, and a millennial says, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's interesting. Trust. What is that like generationally?
Yeah.
What's the relationship like with trust?
Yeah. So for one of the things that I think is important to understand is millennials' lack of trust in organizations and institutions and authority really wreak havoc in the workplace, because it gets interpreted as they're entitled, they go over other people's head, they're uncooperative, they think they know better, right? Like that's the translation of other generation. But what they really want is transparency. They want clarity, and they want to know why they're being asked to do certain things, or why certain people should be trusted, right? I did a generational workshop a few years ago and had a really wide spectrum. And one of the folks who's an incredible D&I practitioner, Elmer Dixon, pointed it out to me, right, that his generation, and he's a silent generation, you just trusted. If they were a doctor, if they were a teacher, if they were in that position, you just trusted that that they were somebody you listened to. And with each generation, that sort of blind faith diminished a bit more, right? So by the time you get to millennials, they say, okay, I get you're my boss, but I really need you to demonstrate to me that you're a good boss if you want me to listen to you.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the underpinnings of trust and how it can wreak havoc in the workplace, like you said, Tamara. And why? I mean, I think at the end of the day, what I always try to do in the diversity conversation is just try to be curious about why people are the way they are versus judge them. Words like entitled and words like, not caring about people. I think baby boomers also get a bad rap that they don't really
100%.
care about people as humans, when that's certainly not true. They just have a different filter, a different way of looking at it sometimes. And to your point, just about, I think one thing I experienced in my corporate career I can identify in this conversation is, I first started out as I was born in 1982, so like right on the cusp. And so that meant like I was raised, yeah, to your point, like very thriving times. The 1990s were great economically. Um, and I went into the workplace thinking everything was equal, that all this great work had been done for gender equality and racial diversity, and like we're good. And then you quickly find out, like, no, there's still so much work to be done. And then at the same time, I worked for a big global manufacturing company that you can imagine was not very diverse at all at the time, and still is not. And you had these people, the baby boomers, or probably the traditionalists at the time, that were retiring, and they were there for like 35, 40 years. And I remember thinking, like, what? Someone's worked here that long? Like, I can't believe it, and then millennials, enter the workforce, and they stay on average, 3 to 4 years, and kind of move around. And that's, by the way, how they get promoted and what gets rewarded as well. And so it was just interesting to kind of be in this crossroads between generations as you saw it shifting. I did the thing where I had a new job every 4 years or so. I would move companies, and, it took some time to go back to school and things, as many, millennials and Gen Xers do. And so it was just fascinating. I remember the baby boomers like, why would you leave this? This is the best job. You stay here forever.
Yeah.
It's just such a shift that I experienced.
Yeah, it is. It's a huge shift. I think it's one of the interesting things about Gen Xers, right? Because certainly boomers and folks from the silent generation, right? That the key to stability, right, with all the uncertainty of the times, was if you get a good job, you keep that good job. And that was how they created the security at a time when there wasn't a lot of things to hold on to. And so our generation, Gen Xers, right, we're raised with, you have a good resume, you get a good job, you keep the job, you can't job bounce, you put your head down and you get the job done. And I think Gen Xers, particularly older Gen Xers like myself, you got jobs with like, go to work, keep your head down, and Friday you're free for 2 days. And then you'll go back to work Monday, you'll keep your head down, mind your business, and then you'll be off on Friday, right? Like that's what we kind of lived for the weekend. And that's where that term weekend warrior came from, is that our generation was this generation that didn't live for our careers, but you went to work and then you had a couple days of freedom to just party or be with your friends or your family or whatever it was. And so Gen Xers are the generation that told their kids, find work you really love. Because I didn't necessarily really love my work. I went to work, I provided for my family, but you follow your dreams. And now that all the millennials are following their dreams, it is just pissing off all the people.
Right. Like, you don't get to do that. I didn't get to do that. That's not fair.
Exactly. And it's so funny when I do trainings, I'll have people look at me and they realize, oh, my children are the same age of the employees I'm complaining about.
Yep.
And they say,
maybe I helped create this.
Yeah. Did I create this? Do my kids go to their job and act this way? And I'm like, yeah. Like this is what happens when you tell people you can be whatever you want to be. You can do whatever you want to do and live your dream. This is what you get. You get people who show up in the workplace and have really high expectations, right? And so that's one of the things that, millennials and Gen Z are both coming into the workplace with extremely high expectations. They have high expectations for professional development and mentoring. They have high expectations for transparency. They have high expectations for upward mobility. And they have really high expectations for organizations living their values. So if you're an organization that says we value diversity, we value equity, we value honesty, and the moment that isn't lived out, you can guarantee you are going to have some millennials and Gen Z that are going to hold you to task.
Yeah, that accountability. Like you said that, I expect that to be true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting as you were just explaining how we raised millennials, myself again being on the cusp here. So I can kind of identify a little bit, but also identify more with Gen X too at times. But my mom, who's a baby boomer, raised me with all of those things. You can be anything you want to be. Everything's possible for you. I want you to find a career that you love. So all
Yeah.
those messages, like, yep. I was told all of those things.
Yeah.
And honestly, it was really helpful for me. Not initially, like the first 12 years of my career in corporate America, I kept feeling like I was trying to squeeze myself into a box I just couldn't quite fit into. And my mom's words would always like just kind of appear to me and it would remind me, she'd say, your job, you really want to help women, Julie. That's what you want to do. You want to help people and you want to help women especially. And I was like, yeah, but you can't like get a job doing that, mom. So I was like kind of realistic too. Like you need to toe the line, like, kind of Gen Xers, like put your head down, get your
Yeah.
work done, and then you can do what you love.
Right.
And after 12 years of just trying to squish myself into this little hole I couldn't fit in, I realized just my lack of sense of belonging. Didn't see myself reflected. I didn't see diversity reflected in any organization I worked with, except for really my grad school experience. Getting my MBA at Indiana University was very diverse at the time, and still is, but internationally it was very diverse. So anyway, all that to say, I know what you're saying. It's kind of like this pendulum that we swing, like we didn't have stability, so we'll give you all this stability. And I had to put my head down and do the job I hated. So I want you to do a job you love. And so
Right.
these generational things kind of go back and forth over time. I'm curious, Tamara, doing the work you do in corporate settings and with organizations, helping them wrestle with generational differences and multicultural differences. Like, how do leaders lead across generations? What are some tips that you have?
So I have a couple really core tips. One of them you've already mentioned, curiosity. If we can begin by practicing curiosity and asking questions and committing to understanding how we are different and similar is huge, right? I've had organizations say, "Oh, will you please come and explain millennials to us?" And I say, "No, uh, I don't think there's a lot of value in just explaining millennials. If you want me to come and talk about generational differences in each generational cohort and how all generations shape and inform your team, I'll have that conversation because we all have to understand difference, right? If we target one group, right? Well, we're going to come and train you about this specific group, and we don't really impart the skills people need. It can then end up getting turned into stereotyping, right? Which is why so much diversity training goes wrong, right? And when we think about what's good diversity training, what's bad diversity training, good diversity training is going to provide context and tools along with culture specific information, right? So I'm going to talk to you about millennials, but I'm also going to put that in the context of understanding Gen X and boomers and understanding what are the skills we need to bridge that. And so that's a really important thing for people to know. And so one of those skills is learning how to practice curiosity and ask questions. And so before we judge, before we evaluate, get more information, right? So if a millennial shares a perspective or a thought or an opinion, or a Gen Z or a Gen X or a boomer, if someone shares an opinion that you disagree with, ask before you judge. It's, that Stephen Covey's habits of highly successful people is listen first to understand before being understood, right? Like really trying to understand one another, because often that asking questions and understanding alone becomes such a revelation that you don't need to have a lot more conversation, right? So practicing curiosity is one. The second is that if we're going to have a conversation about how we're different, then let's have that conversation at the values level, not the behavior level, right? Because values shape and inform our behavior. And if we have a conversation about just behavior, it then becomes whose behavior is right or wrong. when in reality, we're having a conversation about value differences, right? So from an intercultural perspective, some cultures are very timely, right? If you are going to be having meetings in Germany or Switzerland, you want to arrive on time. If you are going to a business meeting in Brazil, you have some flexibility with when you arrive, right?
Yep.
And so we see that with generational differences, and very often those behavioral things show up in terms of channels of communication, right? So which channel of communication is appropriate for a specific communication? What goes in a text? What goes in an email? What is a phone call, right? And these are things that each generation places a different value on a channel based upon their own experience, right? So boomers really like getting people on the phone because that's how you connect with people. You get them on the phone. Gen Xers, we are like email maniacs.
That's so true.
I would dread getting somebody on the phone. I'm going to shoot them an email, even if it's like one sentence. I would rather send a one sentence email than turn around and talk to the person in my office or get them on the phone. And
I think we
millennials,
invented the term shoot an email too.
yeah, yeah. And I always talk about this with organizations because Gen Xers were really prolific with our email. We organize it, we create folders, we have subfolders. We know where, I know an email where I sent 5 years ago, I know exactly where to find it, right? And millennials prefer to text. They don't like to send emails. They don't like to read emails. They would prefer not to receive communication via email. They would much rather you either speak directly to them or send a text, right? So I say to Gen Xers, if you're sending an email that's 3 sentences or less, put it in a text or walk 10 feet and say it to the person's face, right? Now,
Right.
these days we're not in offices anymore, but when we're back in offices, that's something to keep in mind. And so, but I've had, people come to me and say, it's so inappropriate that they text me this information and I don't know why they're texting this to me and why they're not returning my calls. And I said, well, have you had a conversation about channels of communication and why you value one more than the other? And they say, well, no. And it's like, well, you can't expect somebody to have the same values as you if you didn't grow up in the same space, right? And so and there's different values around authority. We talked about that trust issue. And also we use terms like work hard. She or he or they is a hard worker. Well, what does hard worker mean, right? My husband's a boomer. So to him, a hard worker arrives at the office an hour early and stays an hour late, is willing to come in on their days off, and is willing to work 24/7 from their phone, even if that means their family doesn't like them very much for it, right? That's what hard work means to a boomer. To a Gen Xer, hard work means I show up at 9, I leave at 5, and Friday after 5, I don't think about any of you till Monday again at 9. And in those 8 hours, I gave it 100%, but at 8:59 in the morning, at 5:01, I was not thinking about my job. Now, of course, there's variations, right? And quite similarly to boomers, millennials will work 24/7 from their phone. They do not have, like boomers, they put a high value on being available and getting the job done. The only difference is that they don't evaluate hard work by the number of hours. They value hard work based on what they've accomplished. So if they can get their work done in half the time, but with the same quality, then that's hard work. Whereas boomers, it's like the 40-hour work week is how, right, hard work is defined. So having these conversations at the values level is really, really important to bridging and understanding difference, versus just saying, well, they all want flex hours and nobody wants to come to the office and they want to, work from their computer on a beach. And somehow that means that they don't work as hard. It just looks different. So we need to be much more thoughtful about having those conversations at those deeper levels with less judgment, really, which is my third tip of suspend judgment, practice curiosity, understand each other's values, and hold the judgment.
To understand versus being understood, which we often go into conversations just wanting to be heard and not listening. Tamara, this is awesome. Really good content on generational differences and similarities. And I really like what you said, approaching it from a values perspective rather than just the behaviors that show up, and leaning in with curiosity. Tell our listeners how they can follow you, how they can stay in touch with your work.
Well, I invite everybody to connect with me on LinkedIn, which is, you can go to LinkedIn /Tamara Thorpe 1, and you'll find me there on LinkedIn. My website is tamarathorpe.com, and I invite people to go to tamarathorpe.com, where there's information about my leadership development programs and the mentoring events that I will be hosting this year for Next Generation Leaders. For my international folks, you can also find my work at realglobal.co. And that is for folks who are in Europe, who are looking to do work in that area. And you could also find me on Instagram at Tamara Thorpe, and on Facebook as the Millennials Mentor.
Awesome. I'll link to those in the show notes. And thanks so much for being on today and sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Julie.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.